Since the 1880s, Llano Cemetery has been part of Amarillo's history, culture, and heritage. By studying it and knowing the people who are laid to rest there, one can very well consider it a reflection of Amarillo's beginnings and growth. And so it is with that in mind that this presentation has been created for you today. What began as a 20-acre plot of land southeast of Amarillo that was donated has today grown to 160 developed acres with over 70,000 interments. The first burial in what eventually became known as Llano Cemetery occurred in 1888. A family by the name of Morrow was traveling through this area when their 24-year-old daughter, Lillian, died. The young lady was buried on a 20-acre plot of land southeast of Amarillo that was donated by T.B. and Hattie Clisby. 3 years later, in 1891, the 20-acre plot was purchased by Potter County from the Clisby family for $400. This plot became known as the Amarillo Cemetery. Care for the cemetery was provided by a group of dedicated ladies who tended the cemetery as an act of love and community service. They pulled weeds, raked, planted flowers and shrubs, and watered the grass. In 1801, these women formed a permanent cemetery association. Funds which were used to purchase seed and supplies were raised by a $1 membership fee and dues of 25 cents per year. For more than 13 years, the women who belonged to the association handled the maintenance. In 1918, the Spanish flu epidemic came to the Texas Panhandle, and with it a significant number of deaths. With the information and stories that were circulating about the flu, Amarillo decided to be proactive. The mayor and other civic leaders decided to take precautionary steps like closing schools and places of amusement before the disease was able to overrun the city. The ban on going to school and visiting other public places began on October 15, 1928, and continued through November 11, 1918. By December 11, 1918, there had been 53 deaths and 1,095 cases of flu within a city that had a population between 16 and 20,000 people. According to the World Health Organization, the Spanish flu infected about a third of the world's population. Roughly 50 million people died from it. Most of the fatalities were buried at Llano Cemetery in an area specifically designated for those who died of the flu. Simple grave markers placed in rows illustrate the number of dead. 3 years later, in 1921, a prominent citizen, James Nathan Browning, initiated a movement to incorporate the cemetery as a nonprofit association. Judge Browning had served as the first district attorney of the entire Panhandle. He also had been a member of the Texas legislature for 8 years and had served as lieutenant governor of Texas from 1898 to 1902. In addition, he was district judge from 1906 to 1915. Browning's honesty and fairness won the respect of his constituents, who bestowed upon him the nickname Honest Jim. On October 29, 1921, Judge Browning presided at a public organizational meeting on the cemetery grounds. He drew up the charter and applied to legislature to form the Llano Cemetery Association. On November 10, 1921, Judge Browning mailed the official papers to Austin. Later that day, he participated in a game of chess at the Elks Club before returning to his apartment. Sometime during the night, Judge Browning died in his sleep. On November 12, 1921, the Texas legislature approved the charter for Llano Cemetery Association, the same day on which Judge Browning was buried at Llano Cemetery. One of the largest projects at Llano involved the construction and financing of the Llano Pantheon Mausoleum, which took place during the period of 1927 to 1929. The Pantheon was designed by Sidney Lowell of Chicago and constructed of Bedford marble, a stone known for its endurance. Local architect Joseph Champ Berry was the project supervisor. The project involved significant fundraising and advanced sales of rooms and crypts to pioneers including Colonel Herring, Mrs. Oliver Eagle, and Mr. and Mrs. E. W. Hardin. The Great Depression slowed sales and the collection of subscriptions. Mr. W. H. Fuquay, known as the father of the First National Bank of Amarillo, personally advanced $62,000 to pay off the balance of the construction contract. Two additions have been made to the Llano Pantheon Mausoleum. An entrance was added to the building, and a four-story tower was constructed on the west side, uniting the old and new wings of the Pantheon. In 1964, an addition was constructed completely underground. Dan McCluskey of Atlanta, Georgia, and John Hannon was associate architect. Floyd Richards was the contractor. Beginning in 1933, a beautification project for Llano Cemetery was carried out by hundreds of reconstruction finance workers. The RFC was created in 1932 by the Hoover administration to help economic recovery during the Depression. Some of the things done during the project were the laying out of new roads throughout the cemetery, adding curbs and gutters to all main roads, excavating a lagoon with an island, and building a rustic bridge to connect the island with the main grounds of the cemetery. The administration building, along with other structures, was built out of brick from the old Potter County Courthouse that was torn down in 1932 when the new courthouse was built. Margaret Sewald Roberts created and donated interior artwork and carved beams in the administration building. This included a mural which hangs over the fireplace depicting the history of Llano Estacado from the days of the Plains Indians to the 1926 oil boom and the modern technology of the early 1930s. In 1958, the first Gypsy King was buried in Llano Cemetery. Traditionally, Gypsies prefer to dig graves themselves for their dead. Llano Cemetery's policy at that time was to allow for this Gypsy tradition, and this may be why so many Gypsies are buried here. According to witnesses, hundreds of Gypsies from across the country attended these funerals that celebrated the lives of the deceased with food, alcohol, and merriment rather than tears and sorrow. Family members and friends dug the graves. After the caskets were lowered into the ground, they were opened, and as their family and friends passed by the grave, they sprinkled dirt over the faces of the deceased. Food, alcoholic beverages, jewelry, money, personal effects, and other items were also placed in the caskets before they were closed, and several feet of concrete immediately poured on top of them to discourage grave robbers. Solid granite slabs were also used to cover many of the graves. One of the more unique and visited marble features in Llano Cemetery is the memorial known as the Four Chaplains. Here is their story. It was World War II, and the U.S. Army troopship Dorchester had just left New York on January 23, 1943, en route to Greenland, carrying 900 soldiers, seamen, and four chaplains: Methodist minister the Reverend George L. Fox, Rabbi Alexander D. Good, Roman Catholic priest the Reverend John P. Washington, and Reformed Church in America minister the Reverend Clark V. Pauling. During the early morning hours of February 3, 1943, the Dorchester was torpedoed by a German submarine in the frigid North Atlantic. Panic set in among the men, many of them trapped below deck in the dark. The chaplain sought to calm the men and organize an orderly evacuation of the ship. As life jackets were passed out to the men, the supply ran out before each man had one. The chaplains removed their own life jackets and gave them to the others. They helped as many men as they could into lifeboats and then linked arms, saying prayers and singing hymns, and went down with the ship. Survivor U.S. Seaman Grady Clark had this to say, and I quote, "The last thing I saw of them were the four chaplains, up there praying for the safety of the men." Some years after the war, the United States Postal Service issued a stamp commemorating the courage, sacrifice, brotherhood, and faith of the four chaplains. Llano Cemetery is honored to be the final resting place of United States Marine Corps Lance Corporal Thomas Creek, who was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. His citation reads, "For conspicuous gallantry, at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, while serving as a rifleman with Company Number 1 in action against enemy forces." On February 13th of 1969, Lance Corporal Creek's squad was providing security for a convoy moving to resupply the Vandergrift combat base in South Vietnam. A landmine detonated and destroyed the truck that Thomas was in. Almost immediately, the Marines came under a heavy volume of hostile mortar fire, followed by intense small arms fire from a well-concealed enemy force. As his squad deployed to engage the enemy, Lance Corporal Creek quickly moved to a fighting position and aggressively engaged the enemy in firefight. Observing a position from which he could more effectively deliver fire against the hostile force, he completely disregarded his own safety as he ran across the bullet-swept terrain and was seriously wounded by enemy fire. During this time, an enemy grenade was thrown between Thomas and 5 other Marines. Fully realizing the consequences of his actions, Creek yelled, "I've got it, Mac!" and laid upon the grenade, absorbing the full force of the explosion with his body and saving the lives of at least 5 of his fellow Marines. As a result of his heroic deed, his men were inspired to such aggressive action that the enemy was defeated and the convoy was able to continue its vital mission. Lance Corporal Creek's indomitable courage, inspiring valor, and selfless devotion to duty upheld the highest traditions of the Marine Corps and the United States Naval Service. He gallantly gave his life for his country. Decades later, with the help of several people in Amarillo, Mac Thornberry presented a bill to Congress to name the Veterans Hospital in Amarillo after Thomas Creek. It passed through the House and Senate and was signed into law by President George W. Bush in 2004. Lance Corporal Creek is the youngest soldier in Texas history to receive the Medal of Honor and the only soldier from Amarillo to receive it. On a somewhat lighter note, this simple memorial marks the final resting place of Terry Stafford. In an era of rock and roll and Beatlemania, when the Fab Four and British rock groups dominated the music charts, soft-spoken Amarillo native Terry Stafford wrote and recorded the song "Suspicion." It had the distinction of being number 6 on the Billboard Hot 100 on April 4, 1964, when the Beatles made history by holding down the entire top 5. A week later, "Suspicion" topped out at number 3 and eventually sold over 1 million copies. In addition to being a remarkable singer, Terry was also a gifted songwriter, and in 1973 he wrote and recorded "Amarillo by Morning," which was later recorded by another Texas native, country singer George Strait, in 1982. It was one of his biggest hits, and the song has been named the number 12 best country song of all time by Country Music Television. Terry never forgot his family, friends, or heritage in Amarillo. He passed away on March 17, 1996. Although Terry found fame in Los Angeles, maybe he always knew he'd return forever to his roots when he wrote "Amarillo by Morning," "Amarillo's Where I'll Be." There are many other notable and historic individuals and families buried in Llano Cemetery. Names that are familiar to us all: Harrington, Ware, Bivens, Kelly, Donovan, Wolfland, Husband, Hagee, Galeek, and many others that time simply does not allow me to share. In addition to being the final resting place for thousands of individuals, Llano Cemetery can also be appreciated for the number of monuments, memorials, and features that are truly works of art. I would encourage all of you to come to Llano Cemetery and visit what I and many people regard as one of the most important historical, cultural, and architectural institutions in Amarillo and the state of Texas. Although Llano Cemetery had a beginning, it will have no ending, for the history, legacy, and everlasting care of Llano will be ongoing in perpetuity, one generation after another of families dedicated to the care and preservation of this unique institution. You see, Llano is more than just a cemetery, more than just statistical recording of burials, and more than just a place of death. It is very much alive with the memories of people and families who helped shape Amarillo, the Republic of Texas, and our nation. It is a place of hallowed heritage where the pioneers of yesterday rest after their long labors. It is a place of cherished memories where love is rekindled in the heart of the visiting widow. It is a place of distinguished honor where courage has been borne by the soldier now laid to rest, who gave the last full measure of devotion to duty, honor, and country. Quoting from the Statement of Significance prepared by the Texas Historical Commission as it regards the original 52 acres in Llano Cemetery Historic District, it reads, initially a treeless 20-acre rural graveyard with rough native grasses and a formal gridiron plan, Llano Cemetery doubled in size by the 1930s and became a naturalistic oasis, defined by curving roads, rustic and revival styles of architecture, with imported trees, shrubs, and grasses. What was simply a place to bury the dead became a park as well, and thus a living monument to the pioneers of Amarillo. Thank you for your time and the opportunity to share some history of Llano Cemetery.